Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I think we're going to get started. Today's topic, today's Students Talk Back discussions topic, is the refugee crisis at the border, immigration reform's new challenge. So I'll take a minute to introduce our panelists, and then we will get into the discussion. To my left, your right, is Isabella Sayyah. She is the managing editor of the USC Daily Trojan, and she is the Daily Trojan is also our co-partner for this series. So please join me in welcoming Isabella Sayyah. My name is Kirsten Olson. I am the director of the Unruh Institute of Politics, for those of you who I haven't met, and I'll be co-moderating today's discussion. And, no applause, thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, to my right, we have Christina Wilkes. She is a sophomore majoring in political science, and she is also the communications director of the USC College Democrats. Join me in welcoming Christina. To her right is Mike Madrid, who is the principal of the Grassroots Lab, also a nationally recognized expert on Latino voting trends. He's a regular commentator on Latino political issues of both statewide and national media publications. In 2001, he was nominated as one of America's most influential Hispanics by Hispanic Business Magazine. He's also quite an artist in his own right. If you ever have a chance to see some of his paintings, I think you'll be very impressed. Join me in welcoming Mike Madrid. His right is Alexander Kludjian, who is a senior double majoring in business administration and political science. He's also an executive board member of the USC College Republicans. Join me in welcoming Alex Kludjian. And to his right is a familiar face. This is the one and only Dan Schnur, the executive director of the Unruh Institute of Politics. He's also the former chairman of the California Fair Political Practices Commission, and an expert in political strategy and communication, campaign finance, and political reform. Let's welcome Dan Schnur. Okay, so we're going to get our discussion started, and this is certainly a timely topic. It's something that we've heard in the news a lot over the past few months, particularly over the most recent summer with the town here in Southern California called Murrieta, where a lot of Central American immigrants were greeted with protests and a lot of angry folks that were probably, presenting to the cameras a certain view that maybe is a little more hyperbolic than their actual views, but maybe not. So that's what we're here to discuss. So our first question we're going to pose to Mr. Madrid first, and then ask the students to follow up, and then Mr. Schnur. President Obama is trying to push this issue of immigration off until the 2016 elections to help Democrats in the upcoming midterms and delay executive action. How do you believe the issue will be taken up by the 2016 presidential candidates?
Good question, and thanks for having me. Is this working? Can you hear me? Yeah, obviously a big political calculation, I think, made by the president as it deals with the 2016 midterms. Historically, lower voter turnout has helped Republicans. And in the off year, what we call the off year elections, which is when it's not a presidential year, the party out of power, which would be the Republicans, tends to do better. And so I think Republicans feel pretty confident about how they're heading into the midterms. And where it gets particularly complicated for the president is with some of the battleground states, if you will, states in the Midwest and South that kind of more conservative Democrats are trying to hold on to their Senate seats, and the president, of course, has made a decision to delay any action until after the elections. The calculation is a complicated one because it affects both Latino voters, which, of course, is of paramount importance in the Democratic Party and the Democratic base, but also white, Midwest, and Southern voters, where the issue of immigration plays completely differently. The panel will be, going back and forth and speculating about what this is going to mean for the president. But what I do want to point out, just for reference as we kind of get into this discussion, is there's a couple things about the Latino vote you should really understand. As Californians, or at least as people who are attending school in California at the moment, the immigration issue plays very differently here than it does in the rest of the country. And it's important to understand that when you're trying to reach out to your members of Congress or your state legislators, or even if you're reaching out to the White House to kind of make your voice heard. Latino voters, of course, have a particular concern about immigration issues. But the Latino community, and you've probably heard this many times, are really not a monolithic voting bloc, as it were. While a vast majority of Latinos are pushing for, would be supportive of what we know as comprehensive immigration reform, it's important to understand that the diversity within the Latino community is gradually changing, and the way that it is playing in places like Arkansas and in California, even amongst Latinos, is very different. So I don't want to get into much of the political speculation. You've got some really bright minds here that will get into that. I just did want to set the table for what it means when we're talking about Latino voters. On this issue, Latino voters have tended to vote in consistently in a block. That is changing, especially amongst generations. And I'll kind of end it on this just to kind of to I think set the table a little bit. For many years, observers of the Latino community and the Latino voting bloc have said, it's a diverse community. At the same time, it votes 85% with one party. And so when we talk about diversity, what most people will usually lean to is, well, El Salvadorians aren't like Mexicans, aren't like Venezuelans. The reality is that's not where the difference is in political attitudes. The differences lie in generational differences. The longer you have been here, the more your political attitudes change, not just on immigration, but on all issues. And that's exactly like every immigrant group that has come to this country over the past 150, 200 years. And so as we get deeper into the discussion, you probably hear me referencing some of that diversity, because those sentiments are changing, even on the recent policy with unaccompanied minors. People who have been here for 2 or 3 generations view the issue very differently than those that have been here for 1 generation. So when the president is speaking to Latino voters, he's speaking to a certain segment of that electorate. Republicans are increasingly speaking to 2nd and 3rd generation voters, and whether or not either is going to be successful, of course, is something we're going to be seeing play out over the course of not just the next 2 or 3 months, but really the next 10, 15 years. So with that.
Well, I think how this will be taken up by 2016 candidates will largely depend on whether or not any sort of immigration bill is passed by that time. And right now it's looking less and less likely that that's going to happen. It looks like the Republicans may gain the Senate and already have control of the House of Representatives, and it's not looking like the cooperation between the House and the Senate is really going to allow for that comprehensive bill to get done by 2016. So I think it's going to play a very important role. And in this past presidential election, Obama won 71% of the Latino vote. And so I think Republicans are realizing, or beginning to realize, that they have to begin a message that's a little bit more sympathetic to Latino voters, because the demographics of America are shifting. And in order to remain relevant, you really have to appeal to a wider base than just white males, traditionally in the middle of the country or in the South. So I think it'll definitely play a major role for both parties, and definitely. So.
All right. I would kind of just echo what was just said, in that I think 2016 is largely dependent on whether some sort of comprehensive legislation dealing with immigration is passed. And some would say I'm probably a little more optimistic than most on that happening, because I think the Republican Party has kind of a golden opportunity to shift and capture the changing demographics that we spoke of, because that's an inevitable nature of the country. And I think in 2016, it still will be kind of a sticky issue, and for that matter, probably for the next 5-10 years, something like that. I think a lot of the issue is kind of generational and has to do with kind of deep-seated emotions that come with such a passionate issue as immigration reform. I think we'll talk more about kind of the emotional aspect of it, but I think that's what makes immigration unique, because when you talk about it with certain groups, people become, viscerally just attached to the issue because they have such a stake in it. And so it's an issue that's incredibly nuanced from other things. But as far as the 2016 question goes, I think, I don't know, I think it will be interesting to see if Hillary on the left, I'm assuming, is the candidate, and whoever we bring forth as Republicans, to see how that argument is kind of framed and how specifically the Latino base responds to both of our sides.
Okay. Well, I'll make 3 quick points on this, and then let the conversation continue. As many of you probably remember, late this past spring, early summer, President Obama said, if Congress doesn't pass comprehensive immigration reform, I will do reform by executive order before the end of the summer. And that's a bold pronouncement, and those are the kind of pronouncements that bold, courageous leaders make. The problem that the president ran into, not of his own making, is that as the numbers of young people began to come to this country from Central America over the summer, it had I'll say this another way, the increasing numbers of young people coming to this country from Central America over the summer had a very strong impact on American public opinion on the broader issue of immigration reform, and in a very unpredictable way. Generally, when the issue of immigration gets debated, when the conversation turns to a question of young immigrants, children, teenagers, people tend to understandably become much more sympathetic, because they're thinking about kids who came here, often not by choices that they made themselves. Over the course of the summer, as we saw this tremendous influx of young people coming from Central America, national public opinion turned in the exact opposite direction. And it made Americans much less receptive to the kind of comprehensive immigration reform that President Obama and President Bush before him had been fighting for. And so all of a sudden, Barack Obama is on a much more hostile political landscape. And he got left with a very difficult set of choices heading into a very important set of midterm elections. If he goes forward with an executive order on immigration reform, that could have the potential of taking conservative Democrats in states like North Carolina and Arkansas and Louisiana, where the battle for the Senate is currently being fought, and alienate them and anger them. And the president and his advisors realized that if he went forward with his original pledge, given this new environment, it could potentially cost his party some critical Senate seats. On the flip side, the president and his advisors understood that if he didn't fulfill his promise, if he did decide to delay action until after the election, it could cause the Democratic Party base, Hispanic American voters, Asian American voters, young voters of all races and ethnicities, to become very discouraged and much less likely to turn out in a midterm election. The president and his advisors chose the latter course, and right now one of their biggest challenges over the last few weeks before the election is convincing their most loyal supporters to turn out, female voters, young voters, and voters from a variety of racial and ethnic minority communities. So there really wasn't a good decision for Barack Obama in all this. That said, I think the president made a mistake. The president made a mistake not this fall, but 2 years ago, but a year and a half ago, and he made the exact same mistake that George Bush made when President Bush decided to push for immigration reform. There's an old saying in politics: political capital is like ice. The longer you sit on it, the faster it goes away. And when a president has the most political capital and the most authority is right after he or she is either elected or reelected. Karl Rove, President Bush's chief political advisor, now says that the single greatest mistake he believes they made in Bush's second term was not starting his second term by pushing for immigration reform when his political capital was at the highest level. He said if we had done that first instead of a couple years into his term, we might have gotten it through. I think Barack Obama, by not prioritizing immigration reform earlier in his term, made exactly the same mistake. So going back to a point that Christina was making, I say this with great regret, but I don't believe that comprehensive immigration reform can happen while Barack Obama is still in office. I believe it will fall to the next president, Democrat or Republican, to make that reform happen, because Barack Obama, like George Bush before him, waited too long until he lacked the political power to push something important to him through.
Well, just to go back to voting patterns. Mr. Madrid, you spoke a little bit about the diversity in the Latino voting bloc and generational differences versus cultural differences. How do you see that playing out in the midterms next month? And then how do you see those voting patterns among Latinos possibly changing leading up to the 2016 elections?
Great question. Look, I don't think these types of demographic changes aren't really short-term considerations. And so we're not going to see generational differences play out in any significant degree by the 2016 midterm elections. We're probably talking, 4, 6, 8, 10 years out. We're just beginning to see these breaks happen in California, and of course, California is the most diverse state in the union. Having said that, Latinos are as a voting bloc and as a voting group, while as was pointed out, 71% of Latinos voted for President Obama, the turnout numbers coming up in November are going to be deplorable. They're already going to be very low anyway amongst all voters, lower amongst Democrats, very, very low with Latino voters. The president's actions, unfortunately, I think, have left even the activist community extremely dispirited, and so you're seeing really a real low energy level for the typical standard get out the vote efforts in Latino communities, even in California. And so I think the challenge that is being faced by the party in power, by the president, is trying to motivate the base while he's caught in making this Hobbesian choice that Dan just pointed out. I would differ slightly, a little bit off topic, but with what Dan said, I think this is entirely the president's own making. The fact that so many unaccompanied minors were coming was not an accident. Okay, people were coming and are continuing to come from Central America in large part because of the bold pronouncements that the president was making. Now you have to remember, these young kids aren't getting their news the way that you and I are. They don't have a CNN app on their iPhones. Okay, all of this is happening in very rural, impoverished areas, and when there are signals that the United States is going to liberalize immigration laws, when there's very little to be living for in the place that you're at now, it makes all the sense in the world to make a rush to the United States. That's why you saw that burst after those pronouncements, and that absolutely backfired on the president. So what that means with voters here, of course, is really, it's not just the immigration issue, I think, that's challenging the party. I think it's because of some of those missteps that you're going to see a really decidedly low turnout with the Latino community in the 2016 elections.
Christina, maybe you could weigh in on what the Democrats could do to influence turnout?
I would agree that I think the Latino activist community is very disappointed with the president's news to push off taking executive action. And I think it's hard for them going out and registering people on the street. I think they're seeing that Latino voters are very discouraged and they're less motivated to go out and vote. However, I think they're still aware that President Obama is probably their largest advocate for immigration reform in Washington. And although they are very disappointed with his delayed action, I think they still know they need to support him and really try and get at least something done, if not a comprehensive bill. So I think they're really just trying in these last couple of weeks before the midterms to just encourage people to go and vote. Yes, you are discouraged, but if you get more Republicans in office, even less is going to happen. So I think Latino activists are definitely angry with the president, but they still know that he's going to do a lot more for them than much more Republicans in Congress.
Alex or Dan, would you like to comment?
I kind of see the picture a little differently. I think the GOP has a golden opportunity here because we do have a president that has largely ostracized the Latino community, has promised them things, and has not delivered. And like I said before, I think the changing demographics is something that's concrete, and it's something that we can work off of. And I think a lot of the American dream stems out of immigrants being able to come to America and live happy lives, and that's part of the narrative that Republicans do push. And I think a lot of the kind of, I guess, politics tends to frame the debate, and I don't know, right now I see kind of a great opportunity where our base can be appealed to with kind of strategic, I guess, crafting of our message. And I think that it certainly is plausible for us to kind of bring, at least extend an olive branch to the Latino community and say, this is not, we're not the party of no on this issue completely, but we are the party of making sure that this is done correctly, because this has implications for the rest of our country. I mean, let's not forget that Ronald Reagan, one of the greatest presidents that most GOP people, most Republicans, very much revere, he had comprehensive immigration reform under his belt. And so I just think this is more of a question of if we are willing to go out on a limb here, high risk, high reward type of situation for Republicans.
I think you've heard both Christina and Alex do an excellent job of articulating a smart strategy and a smart message for confronting their respective parties' challenges on this issue. Republicans, as the question suggested and as Alex discussed, have a long-term problem for all the reasons that the panel's been talking about. Democrats have a short-term problem. And let's talk about the Democrats first. The Democrats' short-term problem, 20-some days from today, is turning out their base on Election Day. And public opinion polls show that, no question, Christina, the Hispanic Americans and Asian American voters overwhelmingly prefer Democrats to Republicans on this and other issues. President Obama's approval ratings among Latino and Latina voters in particular has dropped very significantly since he announced that he was going to delay his executive action. The message that you heard from Christina is exactly the right one, the smart one for Democrats to articulate. One other thing I'd suggest you keep an eye on. I don't make predictions because I'm bad at them. Last week I was perfectly prepared to predict the Dodgers-Angels World Series. So I don't make predictions anymore. But I will say, rather than predicting an outcome, I'll say keep an eye on the president's decision over his new attorney general. As most of you know, Eric Holder, who's been serving in the Obama administration since its very beginning, has recently announced that he's stepping down, and there are a number of candidates being considered to replace him. Keep an eye on Thomas Perez, the Secretary of Labor and the former head of the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice. I have no idea, nor will I pretend to, on whether the president prefers him to some of the other candidates being discussed. But while the president can and should pick the most qualified individual to serve in a position like that, the political ramifications of someone like Perez of appointing the first Latino attorney general in the history of the United States of America is something that the president and his allies, I think, could see as an opportunity to reinvigorate Latino and Latina voters heading into the midterm elections. As far as Republicans, and this is a longer conversation because I've been talking too long already, but I think the greatest concern for Alex and his colleagues, on this issue at least, ought to be maybe a successful election day this November. And what do I mean by that? I mean, if Republicans retake control of the United States Senate in November, a lot of people in the Republican Party will decide that the reason for that is because they stood fast against President Obama's proposals for immigration reform. And the lesson they'll learn from that, as long as we continue to stand steadfast against Obama and others who want comprehensive immigration reform and ignore Alex's advice, they'll say if it worked for us in 2014, then it probably will work for us in 2016, and it won't. If Republicans come out of this midterm election thinking that opposition to comprehensive immigration reform is the reason they won, I think they're setting themselves up for all sorts of problems in the next presidential election, because I don't see how a Republican gets elected president unless he or she follows the advice that Alex laid out a moment ago.
Thank you, Dan. So we're almost to the midpoint of our discussion, which is the time in which we turn it over to you all to ask questions of any of our panelists. So start thinking of some of the questions you might want to ask. In the meantime, I will ask one follow-up question. I think everyone today has alluded to or has spoken directly to the emotional aspect of this conversation, of this topic. Just walking down hypothetical lane for us for a minute. If refugee children fleeing from involvement in gangs and drugs in a life of poverty were entering the U.S. from places other than Latin America, would the response have been different to the widespread protests that we saw this summer? And so I'll point the question to Mike and Dan first, and then ask our students to follow up.
Sure, they would have been different, but I don't think markedly so. I think we want to believe that we are in a time where this, and it is unprecedented, demographic change is being driven because we're talking essentially about brown people in a white, broader society. But look, I mean, this has been happening not only for the past 200 years in this country, it's been happening over the entire history of humankind, okay? So whether it was the Irish, or whether it was the Polish, or whether it was Italians at the turn of the last century, this same type of nativist sentiment always arises when a community is changing. And that's why immigration reform is always so difficult to tackle, and why it only happens once every 30 years. The stars really have to line up. And unfortunately, when you add race into an already emotional discussion, it just blows up exponentially, and so it gets harder to put the pieces together. So would it be different if we were talking about a Canadian influx? Sure. But it would still be the undertones of different nationalities or differences within humankind. I mean, that's what we do, unfortunately, for better or worse. That's part of our nature, is to find those differences amongst us and be afraid of those. And until we're able to resolve that, that's something that is really the province of humankind and not the province of any political party. These types of changes will always instill fear in society on both sides.
I think Mike is right on this one. Yeah, it's worth asking. It's worth asking why the same types of invective that were once directed toward late 19th century, early 20th century, and early 20th century immigrant groups, like Mike was discussing, why that doesn't exist anymore. Why don't people, use that kind of angry language against Irish or Italians or Poles? And the answer is because most Americans, much more than in the late 19th, early 20th century, have been exposed on a continual basis to people of Irish and Italian and Eastern European descent. Prejudice is a direct result of ignorance, and ignorance is a direct result of lack of exposure. And when you spend time with people who are different than you, superficially, the more easier it is to realize that the differences between you and them are not that significant. It's instructive to me that in our poll, in our USC Dornsife LA Times poll, when we ask about the broader question of undocumented immigration, how much more strongly young Californians support comprehensive immigration reform than older Californians. And that's not because older Californians are evil or stupid. Rather, it's because younger Californians, over the time that they've grown up, like most of you, have been exposed much more frequently to people of Hispanic American or Asian American descent and to people from other races and ethnicities than their parents or grandparents were. So I think those tensions, as Mike said, would exist regardless. But I think as society, and particularly young Californians and young Americans, become more accustomed to a multicultural society, the less pronounced those kind of prejudices are, and the less likely they are to continue.
Yeah, I would essentially agree with what was just said. I think in a case like this where you're dealing with children, it's much different than when you're dealing with adults who are, knowingly aware of what they're doing. And I think really what it boils down to is that victims are victims, in this case, regardless of their country of origin. So, whether these children were coming from El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, these countries in Central America that we did see an influx, or whether they were coming from any other country in the world, there would have been the same arguments being said and the same link to immigration as a whole. Because I think in a lot of ways the issue was a microcosm of our current broken system of immigration, that I would say. And really it's just variables in here. The actual countries that the kids were coming from is kind of minutia. It's just the fact that we were dealing with such an intense influx and how it was played out in the media, and like we said, the emotion that was attached to this issue. Yeah.
I think a lot of Americans have sort of a conflicting idea about immigrants because we tend to look back on Ellis Island in this sort of nostalgic lens and about our grandparents and great-grandparents coming to this nation and a melting pot. But I think when it actually happens, I think a lot of Americans feel threatened because especially I think white Americans who are living in less diverse parts of the nation, they see it as changing what they know, the kind of society they've grown up in. So I think when you see all these people who look different from you and speak a different language from you, I think it can often be seen as a threat. But like every other group, a lot of times it just takes time, and you just have to, and slowly as you get to know people from those minority groups and you realize they're not so different from you, things start to get better. But when you're looking at it as they're coming to change your country, I think a lot of times it can be very threatening, and definitely when people look different, I think it can be accentuated, people's disdain for change.
Okay, so now we're gonna turn the session over to questions from the audience. So if you do have a question, we just have 2 reminders. First, please point it to someone specific on the panel. And second, please remember that we can disagree without being disagreeable. So please be respectful and polite to all our panelists and their beliefs. Nathaniel?
No question about it. If Republican rank and file members were even slightly willing to entertain comprehensive immigration reform, not just President Obama, but President Bush would have passed it a long time ago. So there's no question that the House caucus has been the primary obstacle to comprehensive reform for the last two administrations. So I think the premise of your question is exactly right. I guess my point is knowing that opposition exists, what do you do about it? And again, going back to what I said earlier, I think both George Bush and Barack Obama made bad decisions. They both said immigration reform is important to me, but it's not the most important thing to me. And by the time they got to it, their political capital was at a level where they weren't able to overcome the opposition from the House. But the premise of your question is exactly right.
Do we have another question? Questions?
That's because we addressed the question in such a comprehensive way.
Okay, here in the front.
I think the package that the Gang of Eight put together is very reasonable. I also think the votes were there in the House. They were there in the House. Boehner knew that he could get enough Republican votes with the minority Democrats and move the bill. The problem became what was called the Hastert rule, right? Which is if a majority of the majority party isn't willing to go, I'm not going to bring the bill forward. And so then the question becomes a tactical one. And that's where I think the errors were made by not only Boehner, but I would agree, I think President Obama made I think President Obama had a choice in the first term, frankly, healthcare reform or comprehensive immigration reform. You can't get both. And when the foundational book on the Obama presidency is written, I think that will be the largest chapter because it was so definitive. And he bled all of his political capital for healthcare. He got it, and there was nothing else for comprehensive immigration reform. And so I think the narrow window that did exist probably was right after the election. I am a little bit more optimistic because of the tactics, I think, after the 2016 elections. Trust me, I'm no believer in the vision of the Republican Party. I've been involved with it too long to see how many stumbles it can take. But I think that the president is going to take some very strong executive action shortly after the elections, force the Republicans' hand, and I think that you are going to see something done. I don't think we're ever going to get comprehensive immigration reform done, at least not in our lifetimes. I think it's going to be done in a piecemeal approach, legislation by legislation, which is not the right way to do it, but it may be the only way to do it.
Kirsten, Isabella, is it okay if I take a crack at that also? It's a great question, Nick. What is comprehensive immigration reform? And according to public opinion polling, and according to what both Presidents Bush and Obama have pushed for, comprehensive immigration reform has two critical components. One is a pathway to citizenship. It allows someone who's currently in this country without documentation to work toward and eventually earn permanent legal status and ultimately citizenship. The second is border and workplace enforcement. And our poll, like most national polls, show very conclusively the overwhelming majority of Californians and Americans support both of those things. The overwhelming majority of Californians and the overwhelming majority of Americans believe that there should be a pathway to citizenship for people currently in this country without documentation. They believe just as strongly that the country needs to do more to enforce its borders and to oversee workplace hiring to make sure individuals are not hired without proper documentation. Now, I'm going to oversimplify for a second, because that's what I do. So you have the overwhelming majority of the American people that say that you need both of these things. Well, you have one party that's very, very strongly for border and workplace enforcement, not so much for a pathway to citizenship. The other party that believes the pathway to citizenship is of critical importance, but not all that wild about additional border enforcement measures, until both parties realize that the perfect isn't the enemy of the good, and realize that the American people, not surprisingly, are ahead of Congress on this one. It's going to be difficult to pass comprehensive reform that includes both components. Or I disagree with Mike, which is I'm generally wary to do because he's pretty smart. I believe the next president of the United States, he or she, Democrat or Republican, will pass comprehensive reform that includes both border enforcement and a pathway to citizenship, because I believe that next president will have learned from President Obama and President Bush's mistake and make it a top priority from the outset.
If we don't have another question, I'd like to follow up on something you said, Mike, about the Obama administration not having to, it was an either-or proposition, healthcare reform or immigration reform. Other than just, there's only so many hours in a day, and Dan's earlier comment about political capital, the longer you sit on it, the more advantages. What actually do you mean by that? Do you mean that it was a conscious decision to not take up both? Do you mean that there wasn't the will and cooperation? What specifically do you mean?
Yeah, the appetite wasn't there, certainly in the Congress, and I don't think it would be there with the American public to move on two major fronts like that at one time. And so I believe it was a very conscious decision to either choose one or the other. And one was going to violate or upset one of the core constituencies in the Democratic Party. And so in order to move one of those, he had to prioritize. Yeah. And I don't begrudge him that. That's what a president does. Mm-hmm. And he made the decision, was successful with the health care laws. It cost a lot, right? It cost majorities in the House at least. But yeah, I think it was very conscious.
Do we have any other questions, or did you want to comment on that?
And they're both such controversial issues. Healthcare reform, clearly, as we saw in the 2010 midterms, was almost disastrous for Democrats. It is very controversial to this day, and we'll see how it plays out in terms of the long term, if it gains popularity. And same with immigration. It's very controversial. And so I think taking up those two specific issues in one presidency is probably unlikely.
Were there any other audience questions in the back, maybe? Was there one panelist you specifically wanted to maybe start off that discussion?
Well, again, comprehensive is a word that is in the eye of the beholder, right? And I think Dan articulated what the two elements are very well. One of the, the last time immigration reform was done was IRCA in 1986. Incredibly, it was Republican-led, not just with the White House, but with the Congress. Look, one of the scary things about immigration reform, and maybe that's not the right word, but is we don't know what the outcome is going to be. All we know is just kind of like when you take that first leap out of your undergraduate education, is you make your best bet with all of your experience on what you want to end up being in 5, 10, 20, 30 years. And you learn on the way. All you know is things are going to be very different. And so what I will say is this: I don't know what the answer is in terms of success unless it does incorporate both of those elements, both a pathway to citizenship, which definitely needs to be fixed, as well as border security, which definitely needs to be fixed. But I don't know that we will ever be able to look back 30 years hence and say, boy, that decision we made on comprehensive immigration reform was exactly the right thing to do at exactly the right time. There are still a lot of criticisms of the 86 IRCA law. There are still a lot of criticisms of the 64 Act back when Lyndon Johnson was president. And the reason is because you simply don't know what those policy changes are going to mean. Even when Barack Obama made pronouncements saying, I want to do this, it dramatically changed the playing field because suddenly hundreds of thousands of undocumented minors start coming to the United States. So what we do know is it is going to profoundly change who we are. What we do not know, and is impossible to tell, is what that's going to look like in 10, 15, or 20 years once it's passed.
Luke, it's a terrific question. It's also a ridiculously unfair question for the reasons that Mike articulated. And I think, to be fair, you can point toward any piece of legislation ever passed by Congress or by a state or local government and acknowledge that as time passed, there was an acknowledgement that improvements needed to be made. Pick the most popular law that you can possibly think of. Is it the implementation of Social Security? Is it the Civil Rights Act? Think of any act of Congress or any president, and if you look back at it, you realize that as time passed, further improvements were needed in order to make it work as effectively as the original intent had been. Mike's exactly right. The same thing holds here. So I'd offer you an answer that is not statistical, but more attitudinal. I think the law becomes a success when strong majorities of Americans realize that someone who was born in another country and came here to make a better life for themselves and for their families is just as entitled to that American dream as someone who was born here. And that someone who wants to come here from another country in order to make a better life for themselves and their families sees a legal pathway to doing so that allows them to come here on a reasonable timeline without being forced to break laws.
Any more? Oh,
Sorry.
please go ahead.
Just real quick, I think some of the success can be defined by the most prominent thing that comes to mind is that we would no longer be just ignoring the fact that there are millions of illegal immigrants in our country and that there would be some sort of, mechanism. We would know what would be happening to them if they're going to be, whether it may be, I know the Republican Party and myself doesn't think that straight line amnesty is the correct answer, but to know that we don't have this segment of the population, these millions of people that are here and living as effectively second-class citizens because they don't have the actual status of being a legal immigrant, knowing that we can eradicate that problem and then proactively have something in place to make sure that that doesn't happen again, I think that's one of the most instrumental things that can come about from immigration reform.
Did you want to weigh in, Christina, at all? Or? Okay. Any more questions from the audience? Yes.
Well, I think a lot of it stems to the fact that illegally entering our country is an illegal act. And so people don't want to be seen as forgiving of committing a crime. And so we don't want to open the door to saying, just you can compassionately commit a crime. We don't want to have that kind of ambiguity within the law, because as Republicans, and I think as one of the things that we love as Americans, is we do have a regimented law system. We know what is right and wrong. And I think that's what a lot of the Republicans get hung up on, including myself. It is a problem to come here, break a law, and then say, but you can be forgiven because of this. So in an effort to circumvent that, I think that's why comprehensive immigration reform is so necessary, because we need to make sure that something that's inevitable, people are going to keep coming here. We need to make sure that we're not just constantly confronting a problem that's easily solvable with some sort of reform in place. So does that kind of answer your question? Okay.
Any other questions or possibly comments or personal experiences with the issue that anyone wants to share?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it just as a student of Latino politics, it's been fascinating to watch this presidency, because the president has done some very politically bold and risky moves to his credit, like the one you just mentioned. He's also deported more Latinos than all the other presidents in the history of this country combined. So there's a real conflicted sense of who this president is amongst Latinos, and I think that's both an opportunity for the Democratic Party, especially the next standard bearer, to really re-examine what this growing and emerging voter bloc is going to be in the Democratic Party. And as was pointed out by Alex, that it's also an opportunity that the Republicans there's a huge opening to start seizing the discussion and the debate. For me personally, if I can inject some personal, I'm looking forward to the debate where we as a Latino community aren't focusing just on the immigration issue, because there are so many large problems facing the community that are not discussed because we are solely focused on that. And maybe that's how you gauge success, as Alex kind of alluded to. When we get past the immigration issue, it's good for both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, I guess, but to me that's of no consequence. It's really more about what's important to the Latino community. And neither party has it right? The Democrats get 70+% of the vote, and so there's this false sense of belief that, okay, we understand Latino voters. The reality is the vast majority of the issues matrix that Latinos are dealing with, especially as it relates to poverty and education, they're not even on the radar screen. So while we're talking largely about immigration, I think the president has some really big successes. He also has some extraordinary failures. To this point, the Republicans have extraordinary failures. They're going to have to figure out what some of those successes are going to be, and if they can articulate that in the next couple of years, the Latino community benefits.
I don't know a single activist or supporter of immigration reform, regardless of race or ethnicity or heritage, that did not strongly support the president's executive order on the DREAM Act. I don't know a single activist or immigration reform supporter who felt that that was sufficient. And to be fair to Barack Obama, like any elected leader of either party, he has to balance to the best he can the priorities of competing constituencies. If Barack Obama did everything that the strongest supporters of immigration reform wanted, he would alienate other sectors of the electorate. And as we talked about earlier, I believe, and I think the rest of the panel does too, what caused him to delay further action this year, not only for the Dreamers but for their families, was the concern that would hurt Democratic candidates running in southern and other more moderate to conservative states. When Lyndon Johnson was confronted with a similar challenge when the Civil Rights Act was put before him, and his advisors said this could cost the Democratic Party significantly in next year's midterm elections, LBJ's response was, "What's a presidency for?" And what he meant by that is, this is of sufficient importance to me that I'm willing to incur political damage in order to do something that I think is right. And I bring up that example not to castigate Obama, not in the slightest, but just to say that the calculations here of satisfying one constituency versus disappointing another is a pretty tricky one. And ultimately, the best leaders, like LBJ on civil rights, like Reagan on taxes and national defense, and like Obama in healthcare, said, I'm willing to sacrifice politically in order to accomplish what I think is right. And so it goes back to what I said earlier in terms of criticism towards both Obama and Bush. It's not that immigration reform hasn't been important to either one of them. It just hasn't been the most important issue, and that's why they've shied away from it. The other portion of your question, which I think Mike addressed very well, is more broadly about Latino and Latina voters. And I think Mike makes a good point that it is unfortunate that so many politicians of both parties assume incorrectly that this is the only issue that's important to voters, not just from the Hispanic American, but from the Asian American community as well. And in fact, public opinion polls show very conclusively that among Latino and Latina voters, not surprisingly, economic growth and job creation, education, healthcare, public safety all rank higher than immigration. But what I tell people I know in the Republican Party when they point that out, because inevitably they will say, well, look, Latino and Latina voters prioritize these other issues more than immigration, so we'll get them on those issues. I tell them, I say, I'm not sure you understand. I believe that the issue of immigration is a boulder in the road for the Republican Party in its effort to secure support from Latino and Latina voters. Don't get me wrong, removing the boulder doesn't magically fix your problems, but at least it gives you an opportunity to do so. And while you're right, if you ask a voter from any of these communities, they will tell you that job creation and education and healthcare and public safety come first. But I'm not sure how you win somebody's vote on tax credits or school choice if they believe that you think that they and their family are something less than human. Get the boulder out of the way first, and then allow a broader policy debate to take place. But this reform has to happen, I think, before that broader discussion can happen.
Well, thank you all for joining us today for this very interesting and substantive and complex discussion. I'd like to acknowledge and thank all of our panelists, Dan Schnur, Alex Kludjian, Mike Madrid, and Christina Wilkes. Please join me in thanking them. And as always, to Isabella Sayyah and our colleagues at the USC Daily Trojan for being our co-sponsors today. Thank you very much. And just a couple of announcements before we wrap up. On Wednesday, October 15th, we will hold our next California Politics Roundtable discussion. It's in fact not tonight, it's next Wednesday, October 15th, in Mudd Hall of Philosophy, room 102, featuring both of our visiting fellows, State Senator Mark Weiland and former State Assemblyman Anthony Portantino. Discussion will be on higher education reform and will begin at 7:30 p.m. with free food served at 7:15. And our next Students Talk Back will be on Wednesday, October 22nd, right here in the forum, and we will discuss income inequality and poverty in Los Angeles, again beginning at 12 o'clock with the free food served at 11:30. So thank you all for joining us today.